The movie We Never Finished Rain had been falling over Ashbury Creek since before dawn. Not the loud kind of rain that arrived with thunder and cracked branches from old maple trees. This was quieter, slower, the kind that belonged to late October. Cold rain that settled into sidewalks, soaked forgotten newspaper boxes, and painted the town in silver reflections. Richard Harper woke to the sound of it tapping gently against his bedroom window. For several seconds, he stayed still beneath the heavy wool blanket, staring at the pale gray ceiling above him. The room was dim, carrying that faded blue morning light that only appeared during rainy autumn days. The other side of the bed remained untouched. It had been untouched for years. A soft groan escaped his chest as he sat up slowly, one hand pressing against his lower back. Age announced itself in small ways now, in stiff mornings, in sore knees during rainstorms, in the way he paused before standing. The old bedside clock ticked beside him. 6:14 a.m., always too quiet. Richard reached for his glasses on the nightstand. Beneath them sat a faded photograph turned face down. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked away. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he walked toward the bathroom. The mirror greeted him with another reminder of time, silver at his temples, tired blue eyes, deep lines beside his mouth. He turned on the faucet. The pipes rattled like they always did. Outside, somewhere far down Willow Street, a freight train groaned through the fog. Ashbury Creek was the kind of town people forgot existed. A small Pennsylvania town tucked between dying factories, endless trees, and roads that seemed to lead nowhere anymore. The old steel mill closed in 1998. The younger people left after that. Most never came back. Now the town belonged mostly to memories, and to people too stubborn to leave them behind. By 7 o'clock, Richard sat alone at the kitchen table with black coffee cooling between his hands. The kitchen smelled faintly of old wood, cinnamon, and rain drifting through the cracked window above the sink. A small radio played softly near the refrigerator. Frank Sinatra. Static crackled between songs. Richard stared through the rain-covered window at the empty street outside. Across the road, old Mrs. Delaney struggled to pull wet leaves from her front steps while her golden retriever barked at passing cars. Everything in Ashbury Creek moved slowly now. Even time itself seemed tired. He rubbed his thumb absent-mindedly along the edge of his coffee mug. A wedding ring no longer sat on his hand, but the habit remained. At 7:42, he grabbed his brown corduroy jacket from the chair by the door and headed outside. Cold air hit him immediately. The rain had weakened into mist, but the town still glistened beneath dark clouds. Neon reflections trembled across puddles along Main Street. Richard walked the same route every morning, past the barber shop with the spinning striped pole, past Miller's Hardware, past the old bookstore that smelled like dust and paper, past empty storefronts with faded signs from another decade. The sidewalks were covered in red and gold leaves plastered flat by rainwater. His destination was always Rosie's Diner. The little bell above the door jingled softly as he entered. Warmth wrapped around him immediately. Coffee, bacon grease, old vinyl booths, the low murmur of morning conversations. Rosie looked up from behind the counter. "You're late by 6 minutes," she said with a smile. Richard gave the smallest shrug. "Traffic," she snorted. "In Ashbury Creek. Must have been terrifying." The usual coffee was already waiting before he even sat down. That was the thing about small towns. People memorized your loneliness. At the far end of the diner, old men argued over baseball scores while rain crawled down the windows behind them. Richard barely listened. His eyes drifted toward the television mounted above the counter. A local station was running community announcements beneath the weather report. Church bake sale, road repairs, library fundraiser. Then something else caught his eye. A photograph. An old theater marquee glowing against the night. The Astor Theater. 1 week only. Special 40th anniversary screening. Autumn Lights. 1974. Richard froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. For a moment, the sounds inside the diner disappeared completely. No dishes, no rain, no voices. Only that title. Autumn Lights. His chest tightened so suddenly he thought he might actually be sick. Rosie noticed immediately. "You all right there, Rich?" But he didn't answer. Because suddenly he wasn't 72 years old anymore. He was 24. Summer air, a red scarf, laughter inside an old movie theater, her hand in his, and then the memory slammed shut inside him like a locked door. Richard stood so abruptly the coffee spilled across the counter. "Rich!" But he was already staring through the rain-covered diner window toward the other end of Main Street, toward the old Astor Theater. The faded neon sign flickered weakly through the mist. His breathing became shallow. "No," he whispered. Then softer. "Impossible." The rain followed Richard all the way home. Not hard rain, just enough to soak the shoulders of his jacket and blur the town into watercolor shadows beneath the gray afternoon sky. Ashbury Creek looked different after hearing that title again, as if the past had quietly stepped back onto its streets. Richard unlocked the front door slowly and stood motionless inside the hallway. The house greeted him with silence. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. The kind that settled into furniture and stayed there for years. He removed his wet jacket carefully and hung it beside the door. The hook beneath it remained empty except for an old knitted scarf that hadn't been touched in decades. Dark red. He looked at it too long, then walked away. The living room smelled faintly of old books and cedarwood. A television sat in the corner beneath framed photographs covered in a thin layer of dust. Richard avoided looking at them. Instead, he crossed toward the record player near the window. For several moments, he simply stood there. Then, almost without thinking, he opened the cabinet beneath it. Vinyl records, dozens of them. Nat King Cole, The Platters, Ella Fitzgerald, and there, a worn record sleeve with faded corners, the Autumn Lights soundtrack. His fingers tightened around it immediately. "No," he muttered to himself. But memory had already begun its work. Suddenly he could smell summer again. The world had felt impossibly large back then. Richard had been 24 years old, working afternoons at his uncle's gas station just outside town. He spent evenings driving nowhere in particular with the windows rolled down and music pouring from the radio. Back then, Ashbury Creek still had life in it. Teenagers crowded diners. Factories still breathed smoke into the sky. Friday night football packed the stands, and the Astor Theater glowed like a palace at the center of town. That was where he met her, Evelyn Mercer. The memory arrived slowly now, like old film flickering back to life. A crowded sidewalk outside the theater. Warm July air. Evelyn laughing while struggling to hold a melting ice cream cone in one hand and movie tickets in the other. She wore a white blouse, denim jeans, and that red scarf tied loosely around her neck, even though it was summer. "You know scarves are meant for winter, right?" he'd teased. She smiled without looking at him. "I like things that stay." God. Even now that smile could still break something inside him. Richard sat heavily in the armchair near the window. Outside, rain slid down the glass in crooked silver lines. He closed his eyes. The Astor Theater had been their place. Every Friday night, every new movie, every dream about the future. Sometimes they stayed long after the credits ended, just talking beneath the glowing marquee while rainstorms passed overhead. Back then, the future seemed guaranteed. Until the letter. Richard opened his eyes immediately. His jaw tightened. Even after 40 years, the memory still burned sharp enough to hurt. The last night. The argument. Evelyn crying outside the theater. "You're not listening to me. How am I supposed to believe you? You think I would lie to you." The rain had fallen that night too. Harder than today. He remembered watching her walk away beneath the neon lights, red scarf disappearing into darkness, and he remembered the letter that arrived 3 days later. Or rather, the letter he thought arrived too late. Richard stood suddenly and crossed the room toward the hallway closet. From the top shelf he pulled down an old cardboard box covered in dust. Inside, old receipts, movie stubs, photographs, cassette tapes, and 40 years of carefully avoided memories. His hands trembled slightly as he searched through them. Then he found it. A yellowed movie ticket. The Astor Theater Autumn Lights, July 18th, 1974. Richard stared at it for a very long time. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the town. By evening, the rain finally slowed. Main Street glowed beneath wet neon reflections and fog drifting low across the sidewalks. Richard found himself standing once again across from the Astor Theater. He didn't remember driving there. The marquee buzzed softly above him. Special screening tonight, 7:30 p.m. People slowly entered through the theater doors. Elderly couples, teenagers dragged there by grandparents, widowers in old coats, women carrying umbrellas. Nostalgia had gathered them all together. Richard stood frozen beneath the rain. Every instinct told him to leave, to go home, to lock the memories away again, to survive the way he always had. But another part of him, the younger part buried beneath decades of silence, couldn't walk away. Not this time. After several long minutes, he finally crossed the street. The old theater doors opened with a familiar creak. Warmth spilled out. Popcorn, dust, old carpet, memory. Inside the ticket booth sat Arthur Levine, now nearly 80 years old, thick glasses slipping down his nose. Arthur looked up. For a second, surprise crossed his face. Then, recognition. "Well," the old man said quietly. Richard swallowed hard. Arthur handed him a ticket slowly. "Haven't seen you here in a long time, Mr. Harper." The Astor Theater had not changed as much as Richard feared it would. The years had touched it gently, almost tenderly, the way time touches places that once mattered deeply to people who are now mostly gone. The lobby still carried the same dim amber glow spilling from antique wall sconces whose brass edges had darkened with age, and the old red carpet beneath Richard's shoes still displayed the faded gold patterns he remembered staring at while waiting nervously beside Evelyn before their first movie together more than 40 years earlier. Even the smell was the same. Butter-soaked popcorn, dust hidden deep inside velvet curtains, old wood polished thousands of times over the decades, and something else beneath all of it, something impossible to describe except as the scent of memory itself. Richard paused just inside the entrance while people slowly moved around him, removing wet coats and umbrellas while soft conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling. A teenage employee behind the concession counter scooped popcorn without enthusiasm, completely unaware that he stood inside a place that had once held entire lives together. Near the hallway leading into the auditorium, an elderly couple stood examining framed photographs of the theater during its glory years. "Remember when lines used to stretch around the block?" the woman asked softly. Her husband smiled without taking his eyes off the pictures. Friday nights felt like holidays back then. Richard looked away quickly. Some memories were dangerous when left unattended. Arthur Levine sat alone beside the ticket stand, reading a newspaper beneath a small lamp, though Richard suspected the old man had not turned a single page in several minutes. Instead, Arthur occasionally glanced toward him with the quiet understanding shared only by people who had watched entire lifetimes pass through the same rooms. "You're in Theater 1, Arthur finally said, his voice calm and low. "Same room as always." The words landed harder than they should have. Same room as always. Richard gave the smallest nod before making his way toward the auditorium doors, his footsteps muffled by thick carpet, while distant orchestral music from the film soundtrack floated faintly through the walls ahead. The moment he stepped inside, his chest tightened. The theater seemed suspended in another decade. Soft golden aisle lights glowed against rows of worn velvet seats, whose fabric had faded unevenly after decades beneath projector beams, while dust drifted lazily through the pale cone of light, already stretching from the booth high above the audience. People settled quietly around him. Elderly widowers sitting alone with folded coats on neighboring seats. Women whispering to old friends they had likely known since high school. Retired couples sharing popcorn in silence. Faces lined by time but softened by nostalgia. Nobody here had come only to watch a movie. They had come looking for pieces of themselves. Richard climbed the narrow staircase toward the back row slowly, one hand brushing against the cold brass railing polished smooth by generations of strangers. The last row. Always the last row. That had been Evelyn's favorite place to sit because, as she once told him with a grin that made him feel invincible, people in the last row don't have to pretend as much. The memory arrived so clearly that for one dangerous second, He almost expected to see her there beside him already, tucking loose brown hair behind her ear while teasing him for arriving too early. Instead, only silence waited beside the empty seat. Richard lowered himself carefully into the chair, exhaling slowly as the lights dimmed further around him. Rain tapped softly against the theater roof overhead. Then the projector began to turn. That sound alone nearly undid him. The low mechanical clicking, the faint whirring spin of reels, the gentle flicker before the screen fully awakened. It sounded exactly like 1974. The audience grew still as the screen filled slowly with grainy golden light, followed by the opening credits of autumn lights drifting across orchestral music that felt impossibly fragile after all these years. Richard stared without blinking. Every frame carried ghosts inside it. A quiet lakeside town, orange autumn trees, young lovers laughing beside an old pickup truck, coffee steam rising inside a roadside diner. The film moved slowly, the way movies once had the courage to move, allowing silence and faces and weather to speak louder than dialogue ever could. And then came the scene. Richard felt it before it appeared. A small movie theater on screen. Rain outside. The female lead smiling sadly beneath flickering neon. She turned toward the man beside her and said softly, "Some people leave too early and spend the rest of their lives wishing they had stayed." Richard stopped breathing, because Evelyn had once whispered those exact words to him. Not similar words, not close words. Those words. The same rainy night. The same theater. The same trembling sadness in her voice. His hands tightened around the armrests. Suddenly he could see her again with unbearable clarity. The red scarf around her neck. Rainwater glistening on her hair. Eyes filled with hurt he had been too young and proud to understand. Richard leaned forward slowly, pulse pounding in his ears. How had she known that line before the movie was even released? Or had he remembered it wrong all these years? No, that wasn't possible. Unless... The screen flickered softly before another scene began. But Richard barely noticed now because something old and buried had started moving again deep inside him. Something he had spent 4 decades trying desperately not to feel. And for the first time in years, fear quietly settled into his chest. Because he was beginning to realize the past might not be finished with him yet. The music began almost invisibly. Just a few soft piano notes drifting beneath dialogue on screen, delicate enough that most people inside the theater probably barely noticed them at first. Yet the moment the melody touched the air, Richard felt his entire body go still beneath the darkness of the last row. It was the song, not merely similar to it, not a version of it. The song. A slow orchestral ballad called Stay Until Morning, written for the film during the summer of 1974 and played endlessly on radio stations that no longer existed. Back when people still slow danced in living rooms and believed songs on the radio somehow understood their private lives. Richard closed his eyes for one dangerous second. And immediately the years disappeared. Summer returned all at once, warm air drifting through open car windows, streetlights sliding across chrome bumpers. The scent of gasoline, cut grass, and cigarette smoke hanging outside the old Sinclair station where he worked afternoons after college classes he never finished. And Evelyn. Always Evelyn. The memory unfolded with painful clarity now, not fragmented the way old memories usually arrived, but whole and vivid, as though some hidden projector inside his mind had suddenly sputtered back to life. It was July of 1974. The hottest summer Ashbury Creek had seen in years. The town had still been alive then, pulsing with Friday football games, crowded diners, factory whistles at dawn, teenagers racing Chevrolets down Miller Road while music poured from rolled-down windows. Richard had been young enough to believe time belonged to him. He could still remember the exact moment he first noticed Evelyn Mercer standing outside Rosie's diner beneath the glowing Coca-Cola sign while thunderclouds rolled slowly across the evening sky. She had been laughing at something her friend said, one hand brushing loose hair from her face, while the other clutched a vinyl record against her chest. That red scarf hung loosely around her neck despite the July heat. Richard remembered thinking she looked like someone from a movie that hadn't been made yet. Everything about her seemed touched by movement. The way she spoke with her hands, the way her eyes lingered when she listened, the way she smiled fully, fearlessly, as though disappointment had not found her yet. And somehow, impossibly, she had chosen him. The screen flickered before Richard's eyes while the song continued softly through the theater speakers. Down below, somebody in the audience coughed quietly. But Richard barely remained inside the present anymore. He remembered late-night drives through wet Pennsylvania back roads while Stay Until Morning played on the radio beside static and distant weather reports. He remembered Evelyn sitting barefoot on the hood of his old Ford beneath drive-in theater speakers, while fireflies drifted across nearby fields like floating sparks. He remembered her voice singing softly along to the song while leaning her head against his shoulder. "You know what I love about old movies?" she had asked once. Richard smiled at the memory despite himself. "What?" "They let people feel things slowly. God. Back then they had believed life would unfold slowly too. They talked endlessly about the future during those nights. Chicago, California, maybe opening a bookstore someday, maybe children, maybe simply escaping Ashbury Creek before the town began shrinking into memory the way it eventually would. Sometimes after movies ended, they stayed parked outside the Astor Theater for hours, listening to rain hit the windshield while neon reflected across Evelyn's face in soft red and blue light. Those moments had once seemed ordinary. Now they felt sacred. On screen, the movie couple danced together beneath hanging lanterns while Stay Until Morning swelled louder through the theater. Richard swallowed hard, because memory had finally reached the part he spent 40 years trying not to revisit. The misunderstanding. The letter. The young man Evelyn had hugged outside the college campus in Pittsburgh. Richard had only seen them for a moment while driving past. But youth often destroys itself through certainty. He remembered confronting her 2 nights later outside the Astor Theater beneath pouring rain. "You lied to me," he had said, anger masking fear. Evelyn looked stunned. "What are you talking about?" "The guy outside your campus." Her expression collapsed slowly into disbelief. "Richard, he's my cousin." But pride is cruel when mixed with young love. He remembered refusing to listen fully, remembered accusing, remembered the hurt gathering in her eyes with every word. Most painfully of all, he remembered the exact moment something inside her gave up trying to reach him. Rainwater streamed from her hair while neon light trembled across the sidewalk behind her. "You don't trust me," she whispered. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but the thunder overhead swallowed whatever he might have said. Then came the sentence that haunted him for the next 40 years. "You never even gave me the chance to explain." Inside the theater, Richard opened his eyes sharply. The movie continued playing before him, but now his vision blurred slightly beneath the dim projector light. Because for the first time in decades, he finally understood something terrible. The worst moments of a person's life rarely feel catastrophic while they are happening. Sometimes they simply feel like ordinary conversations in the rain, until years pass, until silence hardens, until entire lives are built on words that should never have been spoken. By the time the movie ended, the rain outside had become heavier than before, falling against the theater roof in long, restless waves that sounded almost like distant applause, fading slowly into darkness. The audience rose gradually from their seats, moving with the careful slowness of people who had lived long enough to understand that certain moments should not be rushed, especially moments capable of reopening parts of the heart that had remained sealed for decades. Richard stayed where he was. The projector light still trembled faintly through the dust-filled air, while orchestral music from the closing credits drifted softly around the nearly empty theater. And for several minutes he simply sat in silence, staring at the blank white screen as though it might somehow explain why the past had suddenly returned to him so vividly after all these years. Around him, coats rustled quietly. Someone laughed softly near the aisle. An elderly woman wiped tears from beneath her glasses before taking her husband's arm. But Richard barely noticed any of it, because one thought had lodged itself painfully inside his mind during the final scenes of the film, and now it refused to leave him alone. The letter, not the argument, not the rain, not even Evelyn walking away beneath the neon lights outside the Astor Theater. The letter. For 40 years, Richard had believed he understood exactly what happened between them, even if the memory remained painful enough to avoid entirely, because life becomes survivable only after people convince themselves their worst mistakes are already fully understood. But tonight something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong, factually wrong. As though memory itself had shifted slightly beneath his feet. Arthur Levine stood waiting near the lobby when Richard finally emerged from Theater 1, his heavy coat draped over one arm while rainwater glistened against the theater windows behind him. "Hell of a movie to bring back after all this time," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the rough softness of old age and too many cigarettes. Richard stopped beneath the faded chandelier. "What do you mean?" Arthur studied him carefully for several seconds before answering. "I mean, some stories don't stay buried peacefully." The old man's eyes drifted toward the empty auditorium doors behind Richard. "Especially not in this town." Outside, thunder rolled softly over Ashbury Creek. Richard drove home through streets shining with rain and blurred neon reflections, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, while windshield wipers dragged rhythmically across the glass like an old metronome, keeping time for memories he no longer knew how to control. The house felt colder than usual when he entered. Not physically cold, emotionally cold. The kind of cold that belonged to homes where too many conversations had never happened. For a long time he stood in the dark living room listening to rain hit the windows, while distant train horns echoed somewhere beyond town. Then, without fully deciding to do it, he walked toward the hallway closet. The cardboard box waited exactly where he had left it earlier. Dust covered the lid so thickly that his fingertips left clean streaks when he lifted it down onto the dining room table beneath the weak yellow light hanging overhead. For several moments, Richard only stared at it. 40 years of carefully folded memories rested inside that box. Movie stubs, old receipts, photographs, birthday cards, a cassette tape labeled simply July '74. And beneath everything else, envelopes, dozens of them. Some opened, some sealed, some addressed in handwriting he recognized instantly despite the decades between then and now. Evelyn's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right, elegant and hurried at the same time, as though her thoughts moved faster than the pen could follow. Richard sat down slowly. Outside, rainwater crawled down the windows in silver lines. His fingers moved carefully through the stack until suddenly he froze. One envelope remained unopened, yellowed with age, slightly bent at the corner and addressed directly to him. Richard Harper, Willow Street, Ashbury Creek, PA. His breathing slowed almost painfully, because he had never seen this envelope before in his life. The postmark read, October 1974, 3 months after their final argument, 3 months after Evelyn disappeared from town. His hands trembled so badly now that he struggled to slide one finger beneath the brittle seal without tearing the paper completely apart. The sound of the envelope opening seemed impossibly loud inside the silent house. Inside waited several folded pages. Richard unfolded them slowly while thunder shook faintly through the distance outside. Then he began to read. Richard, if you're reading this, then maybe your mother finally decided to give this to you. She told me you didn't want to hear from me anymore. But I still can't believe that's true. Not after everything we were to each other. I tried calling for weeks. I tried coming by the house. You never answered. There's something you need to know about Pittsburgh, about the man you saw me with. Richard stopped breathing. Rain hammered harder against the windows. His eyes moved faster now across the fading ink. He's my cousin Daniel. He came to help me because I found out something that terrified me, and I didn't know how to tell you after our fight. Richard, I was pregnant. The room disappeared around him. The clock above the kitchen doorway continued ticking softly while somewhere outside, a car passed slowly through wet streets. But Richard no longer felt connected to any of it, because 40 years of certainty had just collapsed inside a single moment. His vision blurred. He kept reading. I waited for you at the theater the night before I left town because I believed you would come. I stayed there almost 2 hours after the movie ended. I thought if you came back, we could fix everything. But you never did. Richard lowered the pages slowly. His chest hurt so sharply now he pressed one hand against it without thinking. 40 years. 40 years believing she had abandoned him. 40 years believing anger had ended everything. And all this time, she had been waiting. A broken sound escaped him before he realized he was crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears of polite grief. These were deeper, older, the kind dragged upward from places inside a man that had remained frozen for decades. Richard bent forward heavily in the chair while rain battered the house around him, and the letter trembled violently between his hands. Because for the first time since 1974, he finally understood something unbearable. His life had not been ruined by fate. It had been ruined by silence. Ashbury Creek woke beneath fog the following morning. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the town wrapped in a damp silver stillness that softened rooftops, blurred distant church steeples, and turned every streetlight into a pale glowing halo against the cold November air. Richard had not slept at all. The letter remained open on the kitchen table exactly where he left it hours earlier, beside an untouched cup of coffee gone completely cold sometime during the night. He sat near the window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at nothing while morning slowly unfolded outside in muted shades of gray. People often imagined revelations arriving dramatically, accompanied by clarity and sudden understanding. But the truth felt much crueler than that. Real revelations exhausted you. They hollowed something out inside your chest and left you sitting silently in dark kitchens long after midnight, wondering how an entire life could collapse beneath the weight of a single unopened envelope. Richard looked older this morning. Even he could see it reflected faintly in the window glass beside him. His shoulders sagged differently now, as though memory itself had become physically heavy. By late afternoon, fog gave way to another cold drizzle drifting lazily across town while Ashbury Creek prepared quietly for evening. Porch lights flickering on one by one along narrow streets covered in wet leaves. Richard found himself standing once again outside the Astor Theater. He had not planned to return. At least that was what he told himself while driving there through mist-covered roads and old neighborhoods glowing softly beneath fading daylight. But grief often moves people toward the very places that hurt them most. The theater marquee burned warmly against the darkening street. Second showing tonight. 7:30 p.m. Autumn lights. A small crowd had already gathered beneath umbrellas outside the entrance, their laughter and conversation rising softly into the cold evening air while headlights reflected across rain-soaked pavement. Richard stood across the street for several long moments watching them. The theater looked almost beautiful tonight. Not restored, not modernized, still worn around the edges, but alive again. And somehow that made everything hurt even more. He crossed the street slowly. The cold wind smelled faintly of chimney smoke and rainwater. Inside the lobby, the familiar warmth wrapped around him once more. Arthur Levine glanced up from behind the counter but said nothing this time, perhaps sensing that Richard carried enough ghosts already without needing conversation added to them. The crowd inside seemed larger tonight. More townspeople had come after hearing about the special screening. Elderly couples holding hands, middle-aged women reminiscing near framed posters, retired factory workers laughing too loudly beside the concession stand as though trying to disguise how emotional the movie had made them the night before. Richard bought black coffee from the concession counter before making his way slowly toward Theater 1 again. And then he saw it. At first it was only color, red. a deep dark red moving softly through the crowd near the far end of the lobby. Richard stopped walking immediately. The coffee cup nearly slipped from his hand, because no matter how many years passed, some details remained carved permanently into memory. The scarf. Dark red wool wrapped gently around a woman's neck as she stood beneath one of the old framed posters near the hallway entrance. For several seconds, Richard could not breathe properly. The woman faced away from him, studying the poster quietly while soft jazz music drifted through hidden lobby speakers overhead. Gray hair rested against the collar of her dark coat. One hand held folded gloves. The other touched the scarf absently, almost unconsciously, exactly the way Evelyn used to whenever she felt nervous. Richard's pulse began hammering violently. No, impossible. 40 years changes people. 40 years erases certainty. And yet some terrible instinct deep inside him already knew before she even turned around, as though part of him had recognized her long ago and simply waited for the rest of him to catch up. The woman looked up slowly. Their eyes met across the lobby. Time stopped. Not metaphorically. Truly. The conversations around them seemed to vanish beneath the roaring silence suddenly filling Richard's ears while decades collapsed inward all at once beneath the dim golden lights of the old theater. Evelyn's face had changed, of course. Age had touched her gently but honestly. Soft lines near her mouth, silver woven through chestnut hair. A sadness resting quietly behind her eyes that had not existed in 1974. But it was her. Completely. Unmistakably. And judging by the shock spreading slowly across her expression, she recognized him immediately too. Neither of them moved. Rain tapped softly against the theater windows. Someone laughed somewhere behind Richard near the concession stand. But inside that moment, none of it mattered. Because two people who had once loved each other enough to imagine entire futures together now stood face to face for the first time in over 40 years beneath the fading lights of the Astor Theater. Evelyn's lips parted slightly. Richard saw emotion flicker across her face so quickly he could barely separate one feeling from another. Shock, fear, grief, memory, hope. Then finally, almost too softly to hear above the distant sound of the projector beginning to roll somewhere deep inside the theater, she whispered, "Richard?" For several seconds after Evelyn spoke his name, neither of them moved. The lobby around them continued breathing with ordinary life. Popcorn machines humming softly behind the concession counter, theater-goers drifting toward the auditorium with ticket stubs in their hands, rainwater dripping from umbrellas onto worn carpet. Yet Richard felt entirely disconnected from all of it, as though the world itself had stepped backward and left only the two of them standing beneath the dim amber lights of the Astor Theater. Evelyn looked almost exactly the way memory should have faded, but somehow never did. Older, certainly. Time had softened the sharpness of youth from her face and replaced it with something quieter and infinitely sadder. Yet her eyes remained unchanged beneath the theater lights. The same deep hazel eyes that once watched thunderstorms with him from the hood of an old Ford while radio music drifted through humid summer air. Richard realized suddenly that he had imagined this moment many times over the years. Not consciously, never directly, But in lonely, sleepless nights and silent winter mornings, some hidden part of him had continued rehearsing impossible reunions that logic insisted would never happen. And yet now that she stood in front of him, real and trembling and breathing the same cold autumn air he was breathing, every imagined version disappeared completely. Reality hurt more than fantasy ever could. Evelyn tightened her grip on the gloves in her hand before speaking again. "I almost didn't come tonight." Her voice carried the softness of someone carefully walking across old emotional ice, terrified that one wrong step might reopen wounds too deep to survive twice. Richard swallowed hard. "Neither did I." For a brief moment, something fragile passed between them then. Not comfort exactly, but recognition. Two people realizing they had spent 40 years haunted by the same night. The crowd continued thinning around them as the second screening prepared to begin, and eventually Arthur Levine glanced toward them from behind the counter before quietly flipping the small brass sign near the lobby hallway from "open" to "showing soon." The old man understood enough not to interrupt. Evelyn looked toward the theater entrance for a long moment before speaking quietly. "There's a cafe still open across the street," she said. If you want to talk." Richard felt his heartbeat stumble painfully, because this was the moment he had unknowingly wanted for half his life, and also the moment he feared most. Outside, the rain had weakened into mist by the time they crossed Main Street together beneath the glow of old streetlights reflected across wet pavement, though neither of them walked close enough for their shoulders to touch. The distance between them felt larger than the road itself. Maggie's cafe sat at the corner beside an old bookstore and laundromat, its windows glowing warmly against the cold November evening while jazz music drifted softly through fogged glass. Inside, only a handful of customers remained scattered among the booths, an exhausted truck driver drinking black coffee near the counter, two elderly women discussing church events, a young waitress wiping down menus beneath hanging lamps. The warmth hit Richard immediately. Coffee, cinnamon, rain-soaked coats drying slowly near the entrance heater. Evelyn chose a booth near the window where rain continued tracing silver lines across the glass outside. For several moments after sitting down, neither of them spoke. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt crowded. Crowded with everything that should have been said 40 years ago. The waitress arrived with menus, though neither of them opened them. "Coffee?" she asked gently. They both nodded. When she walked away again, Evelyn finally looked at him fully. Up close, Richard could see time more clearly now. The faint tiredness beneath her eyes, the delicate wrinkles near her smile, the emotional caution woven into every expression. But he could also still see the woman who once danced barefoot beside his car radio while summer storms rolled across Pennsylvania skies. "You got my letter," she said quietly. Richard's throat tightened immediately. "Last night." Pain flickered across her face. "Last night," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Richard looked down at his folded hands resting on the table between untouched sugar packets and dim reflections from the hanging lights overhead. "My mother hid it," he said after a long silence. "I didn't even know it existed." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. For a moment she looked exhausted enough to collapse beneath the weight of memory itself. "She told me you wanted nothing to do with me anymore," Evelyn whispered. "After the fight outside the theater, after Pittsburgh, I thought maybe she was telling the truth." Richard shook his head slowly. "No," he said hoarsely. "God, Evelyn, no." Rain tapped softly against the windows. The waitress returned with coffee, placing the mugs carefully between them before quietly disappearing again. Sensing instinctively that this table belonged to something heavier than ordinary conversation, steam curled upward through the silence. Richard stared at her for several seconds before finally asking the question that had burned inside him all night. "The baby," he said carefully, his voice nearly breaking. "What happened?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around the coffee cup immediately. Richard saw tears gathering before she even answered. "I lost the baby that winter." The words entered him like cold water. Outside, headlights passed slowly through rain beyond the cafe window. Evelyn looked down into her coffee while speaking, as though the memory itself remained too painful to face directly. "I was alone by then," she continued softly. "My father had already moved us to Ohio after everything happened. I kept thinking you would somehow find me anyway. I kept waiting for a phone call or a letter or—" She stopped herself. Richard could barely breathe now. The years suddenly felt monstrous. 40 years of grief built from silence and pride, and one unopened envelope sitting forgotten inside a cardboard box. "I would have come," he said quietly, "if I'd known. Evelyn, I swear to you, I would have come." She nodded slowly, though sadness remained in her expression. "I know that now." For several moments neither of them spoke again. The cafe lights reflected softly across the wet street outside, while old jazz music drifted quietly through the nearly empty room. And Richard realized with painful clarity that this conversation was not healing them nearly as much as it was revealing how deeply broken they had both remained all these years. Then Evelyn said something that made his pulse stop completely. "There's something else you don't know." Richard looked up immediately. Evelyn hesitated. Fear crossed her face. Not fear of him. Fear of reopening one final door. Then quietly, almost barely above a whisper, she said, "The baby wasn't the only child I had." Richard did not remember leaving the cafe. Later, he would vaguely recall the sound of chairs moving somewhere behind them, the waitress quietly refilling abandoned coffee cups, rain mist drifting beneath streetlights outside. But the rest of the evening dissolved into emotional static after Evelyn's final sentence settled between them like an earthquake no words could contain. "The baby wasn't the only child I had." Even now, sitting alone inside his car beneath the weak yellow glow of a parking lot lamp several hours later, Richard still could not fully process the meaning of those words, because certain revelations arrived too large for immediate understanding, forcing the human mind to circle them slowly like frightened animals approaching fire. Rainwater slid lazily across the windshield while the engine ticked softly in the cold. Ashbury Creek had gone nearly silent for the night. Most storefronts along Main Street were dark now except for Rosie's Diner, where tired waitresses stacked chairs behind fogged windows while an old country song drifted faintly through the empty street. Richard stared at his hands gripping the steering wheel. A daughter. Possibly a daughter. His daughter. The thought felt unreal enough to belong to somebody else's life entirely. At 72 years old, Richard Harper suddenly found himself staring backward across 4 lost decades, wondering whether an entire human being had existed all this time without him knowing. The emotional weight of it became almost unbearable. He drove home slowly through sleeping neighborhoods covered in wet leaves while porch lights glowed softly against dark lawns, and television flickers moved behind curtains where other families lived ordinary lives he had somehow never managed to build for himself. The house greeted him with the same silence as always. But tonight, the silence felt different. Not empty anymore. Haunted. Richard removed his coat carefully before walking straight toward the hallway closet again, as though instinct itself already knew where the next piece of truth waited hidden. The cardboard box still sat open on the dining table beneath the hanging light. Letters scattered beside old photographs and cassette tapes exactly where he had left them. Richard sat heavily in the chair and rubbed both hands across his face before reaching once more into the box. If there was another child, if Evelyn had hidden that truth for 40 years, then surely there had been reasons. Painful reasons. Necessary reasons. Yet somewhere deep inside himself, another possibility had already begun whispering. Perhaps she had tried to tell him long ago, too. The thought terrified him. He searched carefully through old envelopes and faded papers while rain ticked softly against the windows, his exhaustion growing heavier with every passing minute, until finally his fingers brushed against something tucked flat beneath a stack of brittle newspaper clippings. An old photograph. Polaroid. Slightly curled at the edges. Richard lifted it slowly beneath the kitchen light. The image had faded somewhat over time, its colors washed into soft browns and pale golds. Yet the people inside it remained unmistakable. Evelyn stood smiling beside a little girl no older than 6 or 7. The child wore a winter coat several sizes too large and held a small stuffed rabbit beneath one arm while snow covered the ground around them in uneven white patches. But Richard barely noticed any of that at first, because the little girl had his eyes. Not similar eyes. His eyes. The same pale blue. The same shape. The same expression caught somewhere between sadness and curiosity. Richard's breath caught painfully in his chest. He turned the photograph over slowly. Written on the back in faded ink were only 3 words. Clara, December 1982. And beneath that, she asks about you. Richard closed his eyes immediately. A sharp ache spread through him so suddenly he pressed one trembling hand against the table for balance, because the emotional reality of this moment had finally become impossible to avoid. Somewhere out there existed a woman named Clara, who had once been a little girl staring into cameras with his eyes while wondering about a father she had never met. 40 years. 40 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, school plays, heartbreaks, graduations, illnesses, dreams. All lived without him. A sound escaped Richard then, low and broken and filled with the kind of grief reserved only for irreversible things. He bent forward heavily while the photograph trembled between his hands. Outside, cold wind rattled loose branches against the roof. Inside the kitchen, the old clock continued ticking with cruel steadiness while memory and regret pressed inward from every direction. Richard looked again at the photograph. Clara's smile seemed shy, uncertain, as though even at that age she already sensed something missing from the edges of her life. Then Richard noticed something else. The scarf, wrapped around Evelyn's neck beneath her winter coat. Dark red. The same scarf she had worn tonight at the theater. The same scarf from 1974. The same scarf from the night everything ended. Except perhaps it had never truly ended at all. Perhaps it had simply continued somewhere else without him. Richard lowered the photograph slowly onto the table beside the unopened letters and faded movie tickets, while rain whispered softly beyond the windows of the dark house. Then, for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to ask the question he had spent most of his life avoiding. What kind of man could he have been if he had stayed? Sleep never came. The night passed around Richard in slow fragments of darkness and memory, while the old kitchen clock continued its steady ticking beneath the dim yellow light above the dining table, where faded photographs, unopened letters, and 40 years of misunderstanding remained scattered like evidence from a life that had quietly fallen apart long before he ever realized it. Outside, November wind dragged wet leaves across the empty street, while distant train horns echoed through Ashbury Creek sometime after midnight, sounding lonely enough to belong to another century entirely. Richard stayed at the table until dawn. At some point, the coffee in his mug turned cold again, though he never remembered pouring it. His thoughts moved in circles too large to follow properly now. Clara. The name alone felt unreal in his mind. He whispered it once quietly into the empty kitchen just to hear how it sounded aloud. Clara? A daughter. Not an idea. Not a possibility anymore. A real person. Somewhere in the world there existed a woman carrying pieces of him in her face, in her voice, perhaps even in the small, unconscious habits people inherit without ever understanding where they came from. And he had missed all of it. By morning, pale gray light had begun leaking slowly through the windows, revealing the exhaustion carved deeply into Richard's face as he finally rose stiffly from the chair and wandered toward the living room carrying the old photograph in trembling hands. The house looked painfully different to him now, not because anything had changed physically, but because for the first time he saw clearly what his loneliness had truly cost him. The silence here was not peaceful. It was unfinished. The living room smelled faintly of cedarwood, dust, and old fabric warmed by decades of weak afternoon sunlight, while framed photographs sat motionless atop shelves he had stopped truly looking at years ago. Richard lowered himself into the recliner beside the window and stared across the room slowly. The television in the corner, the unused second coffee mug still hanging beneath the kitchen cabinet, the stack of unread novels beside the lamp, the old record player no one touched anymore. An entire life reduced to routines carefully designed to avoid memory. Rainwater slid quietly down the windows while Richard imagined another version of this same room. A different life. Perhaps Clara's school photographs lining the walls instead of empty shelves. Perhaps Evelyn laughing softly in the kitchen while cooking Sunday dinner. Perhaps grandchildren visiting during Christmas storms. Perhaps music, noise, life. The sheer size of what he had lost became almost physically unbearable. And worse than grief itself was the realization that none of it had been stolen from him by fate. He had participated in losing it. Pride, youth, anger, silence. Tiny moments that seemed survivable at the time until years hardened around them like concrete. Richard leaned back heavily and closed his eyes. Memory returned instantly. Summer 1974. The final argument outside the Astor Theater beneath rain and neon reflections. Evelyn crying while trying desperately to explain herself. "You don't trust me." God, she had been right. And somehow that truth hurt more than anything else now because old age strips away the comforting lies people use to survive themselves. At 72, Richard no longer possessed the energy required to pretend he had been innocent. The phone rang suddenly somewhere in the kitchen. The sound startled him so sharply he nearly dropped the photograph. Richard stared toward the hallway for several seconds before finally standing and walking slowly toward the ringing phone mounted beside the refrigerator. "Hello?" For a moment, only silence answered. Then Evelyn's voice came softly through the line. "I hope I didn't wake you." Richard looked toward the window where rain continued falling steadily against the dark morning. "I haven't slept." A pause followed. Not awkward, heavy, as though both of them understood there were now too many lost years standing between ordinary conversation. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "Clara lives in Vermont now." Richard gripped the phone tighter immediately. "She's a high school music teacher, divorced, no children." Evelyn hesitated softly. "She loves old records. You would probably understand her better than I ever did." Richard closed his eyes. The image formed instantly. A woman somewhere in another cold, small town, teaching piano scales beneath fluorescent classroom lights while unknowingly carrying pieces of him inside her gestures and expressions. "Does she know about me?" he asked quietly. Another silence. Then, "She knows your name," Evelyn answered. "But after all these years, I never knew whether contacting you would help her or hurt her." The honesty in her voice hurt, because Richard realized he deserved every ounce of uncertainty behind it. "I would like to meet her," he said finally, though the words emerged fragile and uncertain even to himself. Evelyn exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "I thought you might." Outside, the rain finally began softening into mist, while pale daylight spread slowly across Ashbury Creek. And for the first time in decades, Richard felt something unfamiliar move quietly beneath all the grief and regret inside him. Not happiness, not peace, but possibility. Small, terrifying, fragile, and somehow more frightening than loneliness had ever been. By Friday evening, the rain had finally stopped. Cold November air drifted through Ashbury Creek beneath low silver clouds, while the town prepared quietly for another early sunset, porch lights flickering alive one by one across narrow streets layered with damp autumn leaves. The Astor Theater glowed at the center of Main Street, like a memory refusing to disappear. Its neon sign buzzed softly against the darkening sky, while people gathered once again beneath the marquee for the third screening of Autumn Lights, their voices rising warmly into the cold evening air, as though the old building itself had somehow awakened after decades of slow fading. Richard arrived early this time. Not because he was eager exactly, but because something inside him no longer wanted to run from the past. For most of his adult life, he had treated memory like an injury best left untouched, carefully constructing routines and silences designed to keep old pain asleep. Yet over the last several days, the past had broken loose anyway, dragging hidden truths into the light with a force strong enough to rearrange his entire understanding of himself. And strangely, beneath all the grief and exhaustion, he no longer felt entirely numb. The realization unsettled him. Cold wind moved gently through Main Street as Richard crossed toward the theater carrying the old photograph of Clara carefully folded inside his coat pocket like something sacred and fragile. Tonight the town felt different somehow, more alive. Rosie's diner overflowed with customers discussing the movie over pie and coffee, while Christmas decorations had already begun appearing in shop windows, despite Thanksgiving still weeks away. Even the old bookstore beside Maggie's Cafe displayed a handwritten sign in faded red paint. "Thank you for supporting the Astor." Ashbury Creek had started remembering itself. Inside the theater lobby, warm light spilled across crowded carpets, while laughter and conversation echoed beneath the high ceiling. And for the first time since returning here, Richard allowed himself to stop and truly look around. He noticed details he had ignored before. The tiny burn marks on the concession counter from cigarettes smoked decades earlier, the faded celebrity photographs lining the hallway, the handwritten showtimes Arthur Levine still updated manually every evening despite nobody expecting him to. The theater no longer felt haunted tonight. It felt human. Arthur glanced up from behind the ticket booth and smiled faintly. "Back again," the old man said. Richard surprised himself by smiling slightly in return. "Guess I missed this place more than I realized." Arthur studied him carefully for a second before nodding knowingly. "Funny thing about old theaters," he said while tearing the ticket stub slowly. "People think they come here to watch movies." He handed the ticket back. "But mostly they come to remember who they were when they first saw them." Richard carried those words with him as he entered Theater 1. The auditorium glowed softly beneath dim golden aisle lights, while audience members settled quietly into their seats with coats folded across laps and popcorn balanced carefully in aging hands. Richard climbed toward the last row again, but tonight something felt different. Not lighter exactly. The grief still existed. The regret still lived inside him. Yet the crushing finality surrounding those emotions had begun to loosen slightly. For the first time in 40 years, the story of his life no longer felt completely finished. As the projector flickered alive overhead and dust drifted through the beam of light stretching across the darkened theater, Richard leaned back slowly in his seat and listened carefully to the familiar mechanical rhythm of the film reels turning. The sound no longer hurt him the same way. Instead, it reminded him that stories could continue longer than people expected. The opening music began softly. Scenes from Autumn Lights unfolded once more across the screen. Rain-soaked streets, young lovers inside diners, empty roads at sunset, quiet conversations filled with unfinished feelings. But now Richard noticed details he had missed entirely during the first screening. The male lead's stubbornness no longer looked romantic. It looked frightened. The silence between the characters no longer seemed dramatic. It seemed tragic. And for the first time, Richard understood the true sadness inside the film. Not that people lose each other, but that they often lose each other while still loving one another deeply. Beside him, someone quietly wiped away tears during a scene near the middle of the movie. Further down the row, an elderly couple held hands silently beneath the projector light. Richard watched the screen while Evelyn's words echoed softly through his memory. "She knows your name." The thought no longer filled him only with grief now. It also carried hope. Fragile hope. Dangerous hope. The kind capable of changing a person even late in life. As the famous dance scene from the movie began, lanterns glowing softly while Stay Until Morning played once more through the theater speakers, Richard suddenly realized something extraordinary. For the first time since 1974, he was no longer watching the movie as a man trapped entirely inside regret. He was watching it as someone who still might have time left to repair part of what had been broken. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath decades of loneliness and silence, something small and forgotten finally began to wake again. When the scene ended, Richard caught himself smiling. Not the polite, exhausted smile he used for waitresses and neighbors. A real one. Small, uneven, but real enough to surprise him completely. The call came 3 days later, just after sunset, while Richard stood alone in his kitchen watching the first thin traces of snow melt against the dark pavement outside his window. Ashbury Creek had entered that strange season between autumn and winter when the entire town seemed suspended in cold gray stillness, as though nature itself had paused to catch its breath before surrendering fully to December. The old radio near the refrigerator played softly beneath static while Richard absent-mindedly stirred a pot of soup he had no real appetite to eat, his thoughts drifting once again toward Vermont, toward Evelyn, toward a woman named Clara, whose face had already begun living permanently inside his mind, despite them never having spoken. The telephone ringing shattered the silence so suddenly that the spoon slipped from his hand and clattered loudly against the stovetop. For one terrible second, he simply stared at the phone without moving. Fear arrived instantly. Not the dramatic fear of catastrophe. Something quieter, older, far more human. The fear of being emotionally seen after spending half a lifetime hiding from yourself. By the fourth ring, he finally crossed the kitchen and lifted the receiver slowly. "Hello?" Silence answered first. Soft breathing. Then a woman's voice, calm but cautious, spoke through the line. "Richard Harper." The sound of his own name in her voice nearly stopped his heart, because even before she introduced herself, something inside him already knew. "Yes," he answered quietly. Another brief pause followed, delicate and uncertain. Then, "My name is Clara." Richard closed his eyes immediately. The kitchen around him seemed to dissolve into distant sound and shadow, while emotions too large for language pressed painfully against his chest all at once. For several seconds he could not speak. He heard Clara exhale softly on the other end of the line. "My mother gave me your number yesterday," she continued carefully. She said maybe it was finally time." Richard gripped the receiver tighter. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the streetlight near his driveway, dissolving against wet asphalt almost the moment they landed. "I don't really know what I'm supposed to say," Clara admitted with a nervous laugh that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. "This isn't exactly a normal phone call." Richard swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. "No," he said softly. "I suppose it isn't." The silence that followed carried none of the bitterness that once existed between him and Evelyn decades earlier. This silence felt different, fragile, careful. Two strangers standing at the edge of something enormous neither fully understood yet. Clara spoke first again. "I almost didn't call," she confessed quietly. "For years I told myself I didn't care anymore. It was easier that way." Every word entered Richard like guilt made physical. He lowered himself slowly into the kitchen chair beside the window. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And he meant it with a depth that frightened even him. Not only for missing birthdays and school concerts and scraped knees and graduations, but for all the invisible moments too. The nights she probably wondered why he never came. The questions she stopped asking. The emotional space inside her life shaped permanently by absence. On the other end of the line, Clara remained quiet long enough that Richard feared perhaps he had already ruined everything. Then finally she said, "My mother told me about the letter." Richard stared out at the snow. "She should have told me sooner," he admitted. "No," Clara answered softly. "Maybe everybody just waited too long because they were scared." The honesty in her voice stunned him. For the next hour they spoke cautiously, slowly piecing together fragments of each other's lives while snow continued falling more steadily outside Richard's window. Clara told him about Vermont, about teaching music at a small high school outside Burlington, about the old farmhouse she restored after her divorce, about her collection of vinyl records inherited partly from Evelyn, and partly, she joked quietly, from genetics apparently. Richard laughed softly at that, his first real laugh in years. And to his surprise, Clara laughed too. The sound of it filled the empty kitchen with something so unfamiliar that Richard almost didn't recognize it at first. Warmth. Eventually, Clara grew quieter. "There's something strange about this," she admitted carefully. "What do you mean?" "I spent most of my life imagining you as either a villain or a ghost," she said. "But now you just sound—" She hesitated. "Lonely." Richard looked down at his trembling hands. Outside, snow gathered slowly along the edges of dark rooftops across Ashbury Creek. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I think I have been for a very long time." Another silence passed between them then, though this one no longer felt awkward. It felt human, real. Finally, Clara spoke again. "I'm coming to Pennsylvania next weekend," she said quietly. "There's a school conference in Pittsburgh." Richard's pulse quickened immediately. "And I thought maybe—" She exhaled nervously. "Maybe we could meet." Emotion hit him so suddenly he had to look away from the window entirely. "Yes," he said almost immediately. "God, yes." After they hung up, Richard remained seated at the kitchen table for a very long time while snow continued falling gently beyond the dark windows of the silent house. But for the first time in decades, the silence no longer felt empty. Because somewhere out there, driving through another snowy town beneath another winter sky, his daughter now existed not only as memory or regret, but as possibility. By the following weekend, winter finally arrived in full. Snow covered Ashbury Creek in soft white silence, transforming the tired old town into something strangely beautiful beneath the pale December sky, where smoke curled lazily from chimneys and Christmas lights flickered warmly against snow-covered porches like tiny acts of resistance against time itself. Richard stood outside the Astor Theater just after noon with both hands buried deep inside the pockets of his wool coat, while cold wind drifted gently through Main Street, carrying the scent of snow, coffee, and distant wood smoke. Everything looked softer in winter. The cracked sidewalks, the faded brick buildings, even the old theater marquee glowing faintly above him beneath a layer of fresh snow. Special holiday screening. Autumn lights. The letters buzzed quietly overhead. Richard checked his watch again despite knowing perfectly well that he was early. Far too early. His nerves had kept him awake most of the previous night, because today he was going to meet Clara for the first time. The thought still felt impossible. At 72 years old, after decades spent believing life had already narrowed into routine and memory, Richard suddenly found himself standing in the middle of a snow-covered town waiting for a future he never expected to have. Cars moved slowly through Main Street beneath falling snow while townspeople hurried between shops carrying wrapped Christmas packages and paper coffee cups. Across the street, Rosie's Diner displayed glowing decorations in the windows, while Frank Sinatra played faintly through hidden speakers near the entrance. Everything around Richard felt painfully alive. The theater doors opened behind him with a familiar creak. Arthur Levine stepped outside wearing a heavy scarf and carrying a broom almost as old as he was. "You look nervous," the old man observed while brushing snow from the entrance steps. Richard laughed softly beneath his breath. "I feel nervous." Arthur nodded knowingly. "That usually means something still matters." The simple honesty of the statement settled deeply inside Richard. For most of his adult life, nothing had felt capable of changing anymore. Now suddenly everything did. At exactly 12:17, a dark blue sedan turned slowly onto Main Street through drifting snow before parking beside the theater. Richard's heartbeat immediately began hammering harder. The driver's door opened, and there she was. Clara stepped carefully onto the snow-covered sidewalk wearing a long charcoal coat and knitted gloves, while cold wind lifted loose strands of dark hair across her face. For one overwhelming second, Richard forgot how to breathe, because seeing photographs had not prepared him for this. She looked like Evelyn in movement, like him around the eyes, like both of them and neither of them at once. Real, painfully real. Clara spotted him almost immediately. Their eyes met across the snowy sidewalk, and suddenly Richard saw it. The same uncertainty he felt lived inside her too. The same fear, the same hope, the same awareness that one moment could quietly divide a life into before and after forever. Neither moved right away. Snow drifted softly between them, while Christmas lights glowed through nearby windows, and old jazz music floated faintly from Rosie's Diner across the street. Finally, Clara smiled nervously. Small, tentative, beautifully human. Richard crossed the sidewalk slowly toward her. Every step felt strangely emotional, as though he were walking not merely across snow, but across 40 lost years all at once. When they finally stood face to face, Clara laughed softly beneath visible winter breath. "Well," she said quietly, emotion trembling beneath the words, "this is surreal." Richard smiled despite the tears already gathering painfully in his eyes. "Yes," he answered, "it really is." For several awkward seconds, neither seemed certain whether to shake hands, hug, or simply continue staring at one another in disbelief. Then Clara solved the problem herself. She stepped forward carefully and wrapped her arms around him. Richard froze at first, not because he did not want the embrace, because he had forgotten what it felt like to belong to somebody again. Slowly, almost cautiously, he held her back while snow continued falling around them beneath the glowing marquee of the Astor Theater. And in that quiet winter moment, standing in the middle of the town where everything had once fallen apart, Richard Harper felt something inside himself finally begin to heal. News of the Astor Theater's closing spread through Ashbury Creek the way winter storms moved across old towns. Slowly at first, carried quietly through diner conversations and grocery store aisles, before eventually settling into every corner of daily life until people could speak of little else. By the second week of December, handwritten signs had begun appearing in shop windows across Main Street. "Save the Astor. One last showing, this Saturday." Even people who had not stepped inside the theater for 20 years suddenly found themselves stopping beneath the glowing marquee at night, staring up at the faded neon letters with the uneasy realization that some places quietly become part of a person's emotional architecture without them fully noticing until the possibility of losing them appears. Snow covered Ashbury Creek heavily that Saturday evening. The sidewalks glowed beneath Christmas lights, while cold winds swept through narrow streets, carrying the smell of pine wreaths, chimney smoke, and fresh coffee drifting from Rosie's Diner, which overflowed with townspeople warming themselves before the final screening. Richard arrived early once again, though this time he was not alone. Clara walked beside him beneath the soft snowfall, her gloved hands buried inside the pockets of a dark wool coat, while Evelyn followed slightly behind, carrying an umbrella she barely used. The three of them still moved carefully around one another emotionally, as though afraid sudden movements might shatter the fragile miracle that had somehow formed between them over the past weeks. And yet something unmistakable had changed. The silence between them no longer felt haunted. It felt unfinished in the best possible way. Main Street looked almost beautiful beneath the snow. Children laughed near the pharmacy while couples hurried through flurries carrying wrapped gifts beneath glowing storefront windows. And for the first time in years, Richard noticed how alive the town still was beneath all its age and fading paint. The Astor Theater stood at the center of it all, like a stubborn old memory refusing to disappear quietly. Its neon lights reflected across snow-covered pavement, while crowds gathered outside the entrance far larger than anyone expected. Elderly couples arrived dressed as though attending church on Christmas Eve. Former factory workers reunited beneath the marquee after decades apart. Teenagers came simply because their grandparents insisted they experience a real movie theater before it's gone. Arthur Levine stood proudly beside the ticket booth, wearing an old black suit that looked slightly too large for him now, though his tired eyes shone with unmistakable emotion as he greeted each person entering the lobby. "Evening, Richard," he said warmly as the three approached. Richard smiled. "Looks like the whole town showed up." Arthur glanced toward the crowded sidewalk outside. "People don't come to save buildings," he said quietly. "They come to save the parts of themselves they left inside them." The lobby glowed with warmth and memory. Fresh popcorn filled the air while Christmas garlands wrapped around faded banisters and old movie posters lined the walls like relics from another lifetime. Everywhere Richard looked, people were reminiscing. "That balcony used to be the best place to sneak kisses. My father brought me here after every Little League game. I saw my wife for the first time in this lobby in 1968. The theater no longer felt like a business tonight. It felt like collective memory made physical. Inside Theater 1, every seat filled quickly. People squeezed together along the walls while extra folding chairs appeared near the aisles. And as the lights slowly dimmed beneath the low mechanical hum of the projector, a deep, emotional stillness settled across the room. Richard sat between Clara and Evelyn in the last row. The same row where 40 years earlier he had unknowingly watched his entire future slip away. But tonight, the row no longer belonged only to regret. Tonight, it belonged to return. As autumn lights flickered once more across the screen, Richard found himself watching the audience almost as much as the movie itself. Tears glimmered beneath projector light. Hands found each other quietly in darkness. People laughed softly at scenes they had likely memorized decades earlier. And for the first time, Richard fully understood why this theater mattered so deeply to the town. Because old places remember people even after people stop remembering themselves. Near the film's ending, when the famous final monologue played beneath snowfall on screen, Arthur quietly stepped into the auditorium and stood near the entrance, watching the audience with tears resting openly in his eyes. Richard noticed him immediately, and somehow he understood before anyone spoke. This truly was the end. When the credits finally rolled, nobody stood. The audience remained seated in silence while projector light flickered gently across aging faces filled with memory and grief. Then slowly, almost instinctively, the entire theater began applauding. Not for the movie, for the years, for the people they once were, for everything time had failed to completely erase. And as applause echoed through the old theater one final time, Richard realized something extraordinary. Some places survive long after they disappear. The applause faded slowly into silence, yet nobody inside Theater 1 seemed ready to leave. The credits continued rolling across the screen while soft orchestral music drifted through the auditorium. And beneath the flickering projector light, the audience remained seated together as though everyone understood instinctively that this night deserved to last a little longer before becoming memory. Snow whispered softly against the theater roof overhead. Richard sat motionless beside Clara and Evelyn, his hands folded tightly in his lap while emotions moved heavily through him with a force that felt almost impossible to contain now. 40 years. 40 years of loneliness, of silence, of believing life had already finished revealing itself, and somehow all of it had led him back here, To this theater, to this town, to these people. Arthur Levine slowly made his way toward the front of the auditorium while the audience watched quietly. The old man looked smaller tonight beneath the enormous silver screen, his shoulders bent gently with age and decades spent caring for a building most people had stopped noticing long ago. He cleared his throat softly before speaking. When I bought this theater in 1971, Arthur began, his weathered voice echoing warmly through the silent room. People told me movies were dying already. A few quiet laughs moved through the audience. Arthur smiled faintly. Then television was supposed to kill theaters, then cable, then videotapes, then streaming. He glanced upward toward the projector beam. But somehow people kept showing up anyway. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd. Not because movies are perfect, he continued quietly, but because for a couple hours they remind us we're not alone. The room grew still again. Richard felt Clara wipe gently beneath her eyes beside him. Arthur looked toward the back row then, toward Richard. And after a long pause, he smiled softly. "Some stories," he said, "just need more time before they're finished." The words settled deeply into the room. Richard lowered his eyes immediately, because suddenly he understood something painful and beautiful at once. This town had quietly watched his heartbreak unfold decades earlier. People remembered, perhaps not every detail, not every argument, not every silence, but small towns remember sadness, especially the kind connected to places like this. Arthur stepped aside slowly, and before Richard fully understood what he was doing, he found himself standing. The movement startled even Clara. "Dad?" But Richard barely heard her, because something inside him had shifted over these past weeks. Some old fear slowly loosening after decades of control. And now the weight of everything unsaid felt heavier than the fear itself. The auditorium watched silently as Richard walked down the aisle toward the front of the theater, his footsteps soft against worn carpet, while projector light moved across him in pale, flickering gold. He turned slowly toward the audience, toward Evelyn, toward Clara, toward the town that had unknowingly carried pieces of his broken life for 40 years. For several seconds he could not speak. Emotion closed painfully around his throat. Then finally, quietly, he began. "I spent most of my life believing time only takes things away from people." The theater remained perfectly silent, except for the low hum of the projector overhead. Richard swallowed hard. "I thought getting older meant learning how to live with regret." His voice trembled slightly now. "And eventually I got so used to being lonely that I stopped imagining life could still change." Evelyn watched him with tears shining openly in her eyes. Richard looked toward her carefully. "There was a night outside this theater in 1974, he continued softly, when a young woman tried to explain something to me, and instead of listening, I chose pride." Pain moved visibly through Evelyn's expression. Richard's own eyes blurred now. "I told myself for 40 years that losing her was fate." He shook his head slowly. "But it wasn't fate. It was fear. Fear of being hurt. Fear of trusting someone completely." The room remained absolutely still. Somewhere near the middle rows, someone quietly began crying. Richard turned toward Clara then, his daughter. The word still felt miraculous. And because of that fear, he said, voice breaking openly now, I missed an entire lifetime with someone I should have loved from the moment she entered this world. Clara covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Richard looked down briefly before continuing. I can't get those years back. His breathing shook now. I can't undo birthdays or Christmas mornings or all the moments I wasn't there. Then slowly he lifted his eyes again. But if there's one thing this theater reminded me, he glanced upward toward the projector light moving gently through darkness above them. It's that sometimes life gives people one final chance to stop hiding from each other. Silence filled the auditorium completely. Warm, heavy, human. Richard looked toward Evelyn one final time. I loved you then, he whispered, and I never really stopped. The words seemed to hang suspended beneath the projector beam itself. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Evelyn stood slowly from the last row, tears running openly down her face while snow continued falling softly outside the old theater windows. And in that moment, beneath fading lights and 40 years of memory, Richard Harper finally stopped running from his own life. Christmas arrived quietly in Ashbury Creek that year. Snow covered rooftops and sidewalks in soft white layers, while warm yellow lights glowed from nearly every window along Main Street, transforming the old town into something peaceful enough to feel almost untouched by time. The Astor Theater officially closed 3 days before Christmas. Arthur Levine locked the front doors himself just after midnight following the final holiday screening, though rumors spread quickly afterward that several townspeople had already begun discussing ways to restore and reopen the building someday. Nobody in Ashbury Creek seemed fully ready to let it go, least of all Richard. Yet strangely, losing the theater no longer felt entirely tragic, because some endings arrive not to destroy something but to make people finally notice what mattered all along. Christmas Eve settled over the town beneath gentle snowfall and the distant sound of church bells drifting through cold night air. Inside Richard's house, warmth filled rooms that had once felt permanently silent. Music played softly from the old record player near the living room window, while the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, coffee, and baked pie drifted through the house in comforting waves. Clara stood in the kitchen laughing quietly while attempting to help Evelyn remove an overcooked tray of dinner rolls from the oven, though both women seemed too distracted by conversation to care much about the smoke curling toward the ceiling. You definitely inherited his cooking skills, Evelyn teased. Richard laughed from the dining room while arranging silverware at a table finally large enough to feel lived in again. The sound startled him slightly, not because laughter felt unfamiliar anymore, but because happiness did. Outside the windows, snow continued falling steadily beneath glowing streetlights, while old jazz records spun softly through the house. Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, songs Richard had once listened to alone, now somehow transformed completely simply because other voices existed beside them. The evening moved slowly, comfortably, like something healing itself in real time. After dinner, Clara wandered toward the bookshelf in the living room while holding a mug of coffee between both hands. You still kept all your records, she observed with a smile. Richard nodded. Could never bring myself to throw them out. Clara carefully lifted one from the shelf. The Autumn Lights soundtrack. She looked toward him knowingly. So this movie really changed everything, huh? Richard glanced toward Evelyn sitting quietly beside the Christmas tree lights. Then back toward Clara. No, he said softly after a moment. The movie just reminded us who we already were. Silence settled gently across the room afterward. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind families share when words are no longer needed every second to fill empty spaces. Richard looked around the house slowly. At Clara laughing quietly while flipping through old vinyl sleeves. At Evelyn resting peacefully beside glowing Christmas lights. At the snowfall outside. At the life somehow unfolding here after he had spent decades believing his story already ended. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard no longer felt haunted by the man he could have been. Because perhaps healing did not require recovering every lost year. Perhaps healing simply meant finally allowing yourself to live honestly inside the years that remained. Later that night, after Clara and Evelyn had gone upstairs, Richard stepped quietly outside onto the front porch, carrying a cup of coffee, while snow continued drifting through the sleeping town in soft silence. Ashbury Creek looked beautiful beneath winter light, peaceful, timeless. Across town, beyond snowy rooftops and empty streets, the dark outline of the Astor Theater still stood beneath its frozen marquee. Closed now, silent, yet somehow still alive. Richard imagined the old projector resting quietly inside the empty auditorium, dust floating through pale moonlight where films once flickered across velvet seats filled with strangers carrying private griefs and impossible hopes. Then he smiled softly to himself, because somewhere between old movie reels and unfinished conversations, between regret and memory and second chances, that theater had managed to do something extraordinary. It had returned lost people to one another. Richard looked upward as snowflakes drifted slowly through the night sky. And for the first time in 40 years, the future no longer frightened him. Far away, church bells echoed softly through Ashbury Creek, while warm light glowed behind him from the windows of the house now filled once again with life. Inside, laughter rose faintly from upstairs. Richard listened to it for a long moment, then quietly went back inside.